Welcome to Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today's video covers lectures 6 to 8 in Seminar 4. In section 2 of Seminar 4, entitled The Perverse Ways of Desire, Lacan performs a structural analysis of cases that will provide insight into perversion. Such a structural analysis entails consideration of object relations and the three lacks through the intersecting registers of the imaginary, real, and symbolic. Lacan faults other analytic approaches for only considering the imaginary dimension of object relations in terms of frustrations that occur in the pre-Oedipal child that are then manifested in adulthood. That is, in the child before being fully structured through the symbolic. However, such frustrations and the privations that follow are only articulated retroactively through having already gone through the Oedipal complex. So any pre-Oedipal frustration is worked through then from the point of view of castration having already taken place. It's important to keep this in mind as we take up one of the three case studies provided by Lacan in these lectures. So in this video, I'll present some of the main features of one of those cases, which will lead to an examination of the concepts of the phallus and the gift. For the video that follows after this in the series, I'll continue with the examination of this case as it pertains to the clinical structure of perversion and contrast it with another case Lacan presents in these lectures, that of the young woman Dora. And in doing so, we'll show how what is at stake in addressing perversion is a matter of structure and not really behavior or affects. The case study drawn from Freud's writings is of an 18-year-old woman from high society sent to him upon the urging of her family. The precipitating issue that brought her into analysis was a relationship with a woman 10 years her senior who didn't have the best reputation, and who I'll be referring to as the older lady here. One day, the patient's father spots the two being rather conspicuous in their expressions of love. Upon noting the father's disapproving look and seeing them, the older lady became angry with the young woman out of concern for the complications that might ensue in being involved with a woman so publicly, especially one from upper society. This event is followed by the subject's suicide attempt and jumping off a ledge, which she survives, leaving her with some broken bones. There were no noteworthy pathological symptoms, and development appeared normal up until a certain incident in which, at age 15, the subject's mother gave birth to a younger brother. And leading up to that event, the young woman doted upon another boy who she would meet with that boy's parents in a nearby park. I want to add a few more points that are not very clear or explicit in Lacan's summary, but one finds in Freud's text. Even prior to the incident, the young lady had a habit of trying to show herself openly with the older lady by taking walks on streets near where the father worked. The body of the older lady reminded the young woman of her older brother, and even before the birth of her younger brother, the young woman displayed interest in older women. She had been in love with a strict and unapproachable mistress and had taken a keen interest in various young mothers. We can frame this case as unfolding in three stages. First, there is the previously established situation that achieved a structural equilibrium in which the young woman had as her object choice the young boy from the park. Second, there is an interruption of this equilibrium in the arrival of a younger brother. Third, there is a reformulation of the prior structure to achieve a new equilibrium, which also falls apart upon the rejection she endured from the older lady. One might be tempted, as I was, to hastily conclude that the three stages here correspond to the three lacks of frustration, privation, and castration, respectively. However, that is not correct, since by the time the patient reached the first stage, symbolic castration had already taken hold. However, when that resolution has been disturbed, We can now retroactively see how these lacks play themselves out, though in a manner that will never be fully removed from the symbolic. It's also for this reason, when analyzing this case, the identified objects will not always fall so neatly into imaginary, symbolic, and real registers due to the historical layering or superimposing and substituting of one object for another, and that object in turn being substituted for still other objects, etc. So let's now take up stage one, which will be the only stage we'll consider for this video, which was identified as a kind of asymptomatic situation. The young boy she doted upon at the park, though real, is conceptualized to be an imaginary substitute for the phallus that in the patient's fantasy life becomes a gift given from the symbolic father. In being given the phallus that she lacks, a lack she identifies with at the level of her ego, her subjectivity is positioned as the imaginary mother who is in relation to what lies beyond the child, that being her own father, who is situated at the level of the symbolic, and thus the one who can provide the symbolic phallus. As such, we might say that the young woman's unconscious entails the discourse between imaginary mother and symbolic father. It is this discourse which I believe structures the dynamic between the young woman and the boy she meets at the park, which takes place at the level of the imaginary relation. So in that Lacanian rendering of the situation of stage one, we have to now ask, what is the phallus? To understand something of what Lacan means by this concept, let's begin by tracing out the unfolding of the three lacks. The child encounters lack for the first time in their frustration by the absence of the symbolic mother, who fails to provide the real object, the breast. It's this frustration that will initiate a certain separation from the primordial oceanic oneness that the child experiences with the mother and that Freud had described. This frustration in inducing separation thus makes possible some preliminary grasp of the otherness of the mother, introducing some push to look for something beyond the real object itself, but that still is coming from the mother, that being her love. The child demands this love over and beyond the need for material sustenance, which allows for a transformation from what Lacan will call in these lectures the frustration of jouissance to the frustration of love. Now, at some point in demanding to be loved, the child discovers that the mother wants something beyond the child, something the child has no direct access to except through conjuring up imaginary objects that function as that thing the mother is seeking beyond the child. At the same time, this entails some preliminary recognition that the mother lacks something, since desire and lack are inseparable for Lacan. The imaginary phallus is the sign for this lack, that thing that the mother desires but doesn't yet possess. And so I'm tending to think of the imaginary phallus as referring primarily to a sign of lack in the other, as well as that which provides us a sense that we can become the be-all, end-all of satisfaction for the other by filling that lack, to the degree we can identify with this phallus. It is a kind of narcissistic fantasy, no doubt. The child, in seeking the mother's love, adopts the strategy of attempting to become the phallus, to become what the mother desires, to adopt certain ways of being so as to please her. At some point, then, the fourth figure intervenes in the triad of mother, child, phallus, a representative of symbolic authority that prohibits a child from ever becoming this imaginary phallus for the mother, which I come to understand as meaning that the child has to confront the fact that they will never be enough to complete the other. Now there's a fundamental hole that no imaginary phallus can ever fill, so to speak, try as we might. So the child will have to come to terms with their own lack, their own unavoidable incompleteness. It's at this point where privation and castration enter. Now, Lacan doesn't do a lot with the distinction between castration and privation, as he does between privation and frustration. So it's a little unclear to me at this point how to neatly divide these. But as far as I understand, and as mentioned in the previous video, privation concerns a symbolic object, whereas castration is in relation to an imaginary object. So how I've conceptualized this is as follows. Frustration is lack due to someone depriving me of something owed to me. Privation entails an irremediable hole or incompleteness in myself, as well as in the mother. And castration is the acceptance of having one's lack be under the dictates of a symbolic authority, which will be the guiding light for substitute satisfactions going forward. So now, what is the connection between the imaginary phallus and the symbolic phallus? Lacan states that the phallus must be raised to the level of the symbolic gift, which normalizes the subject's position within a set of essential prohibitions that facilitates the overall circulation of gifts. What does this mean? And how is it that the gift can be equated with the symbolic phallus? To make progress with these questions, we need to briefly reflect upon what a gift is and how it functions. In the book, The Gift, Forms and Functions of Exchange in Archaic Societies, Marcel Mauss observes the practice of reciprocal exchanges through gift giving between different communities. These practices centered around systems of exchange guided by cultural obligations in which one group furnishes the most generous, excessive gift possible, which then places the receiving group in a kind of symbolic debt whereby they must now attempt to outdo this gift by furnishing an even greater, more excessive one. The obligation to reciprocate makes this gift economy run and forms the basis for a kind of peaceful coexistence among groups, while also providing an avenue for expressing one's superiority over another by displaying one's abundant wealth and resources. The one that is most powerful is the one that gives the best gifts. The gift economy departs from barter and market economies in which, at least in principle, goods and services are exchanged based on their equitable value. Also, whereas in market economies, the economic relationship ends as soon as the transaction is complete, in a gift economy, there is established a protracted relationship that extends well after the gift has been delivered. As such, gifts are not the same as commodities, since gifts are defined by their degree of excessiveness, sacrifice, and lack of proportion to anything that's been received. It's also the case that the object itself is secondary to the symbolic nature of the gift as a display of power and prestige through establishing this symbolic debt. A more relatable example may be the situation in which you go out to dinner with a friend who, at the end of the meal, offers to pay for the entire thing. What happens implicitly, and perhaps beyond the conscious awareness of the giver, though not always, is the establishment of a debt that will create a sense of obligation to reciprocate the gift next time. Gifts are, according to this analysis, never pure and always have strings attached. But this is not a bad thing for Mauss, and in fact is the basis for establishing a peaceful coexistence among individuals and groups. In light of Marcel Mauss's analysis of gift giving, we might be able to see how castration fits in and can begin to clarify what it means to raise the imaginary phallus to the level of symbolic gift. The object, the imaginary phallus, is only desired insofar as it lacks something that is given through it, something that can never in itself be possessed, the symbolic phallus. So if my wife asks for me to surprise her with flowers sometime, the demand for flowers belies a desire for something more than flowers, something that flowers don't have in themselves, essentially. But by lacking that thing desired, there's actually a space through which it's possible that they can deliver a gift through them. If the flowers are without such lack, so to speak, they're loved for themselves and thus loved as mere objects rather than as gifts. But what if she more directly demands that I love her? How or when is love a gift? It's when I desire my wife for what she lacks, to love what is beyond her, that which I can never possess, again, the symbolic phallus. And what my wife desires in my loving her is to love that in her which she lacks, which I think can also be described as a desire for her desire. If I only loved her for the sake of herself alone, it would be like loving flowers because of how they narcissistically gratify me. Such a love could be described as being masturbatory, hence why Lacan will state in these lectures, Love doesn't simply make do without satisfaction, but aims very precisely for this non satisfaction. It instates lack in the relationship with the object as the very realm in which an ideal love can blossom. So here we can perhaps understand Lacan's claim that the principle guiding the gift exchange of love is rien pour rien, giving nothing for nothing. To love means to give what one lacks to one who also lacks. Lacan notes that this is even true for God, who is imagined to be whole and yet lacks one essential thing: existence, Lacan says. God forever lacks because he doesn't exist. And there is no reason to love God save that perhaps he doesn't exist. Those lines need a little unpacking to understand what he means there, but let's just bring this back now as we conclude to imaginary phallus and symbolic phallus. If the imaginary phallus is the object of desire, raising it to the level of symbolic phallus ensures that desire does not remain fixated upon the object, but that the object itself becomes a signifier of the other's desire, which will allow my own desire for the object not get stuck on that object, but to desire what is beyond it altogether. Though I'm not sure yet, it may be the case that this imaginary phallus raised to the level of symbolic gift and symbolic phallus is what will later be formulated as objet patia, which is described as the object of desire that we seek in the other, and further on becomes the object cause of desire. So in other words, the imaginary phallus may be the thing I think I desire. It delivers my desire its meaning, its signifieds. But the symbolic phallus is that within the imaginary phallus that is what moves my desire toward that object in the first place. It is a signifier of desire rather than a signified. We'll see how well that interpretation holds up over time. In the situation thus far described of the case of the young woman, it is the child who functions as that substitute for the imaginary phallus, serving as a gift from the symbolic father who, through the child, offers the promise of what she herself lacks. However, what happens once the situation no longer supports this child as the imaginary phallus? That is, once she is castrated upon being prohibited from deriving any further enjoyment from this imaginary phallus that is the boy. How will the structural dimensions of the young woman's situation transform? It will be to these questions we'll turn to in the next video, where we will consider how the concepts of the phallus and the gift can clarify something as to the structural dimensions pertaining to perversion. If you found this video helpful and it's within your means, please consider making a super thank you tip. You can find the super thank you button below this video. If you wish to be an ongoing supporter of this channel, you can do so on Patreon, where I offer video transcripts and unedited materials. The link is below. I want to thank the following for already supporting this channel on Patreon. You can also support this channel by liking and sharing this video and subscribing to my channel. I've included a few links for some resources on the topic of phallus and gift down below, including an article that I wrote almost 8 or 9 years ago on the topic of the gift, well before I was immersing myself in Lacanian thought, just in case that is of interest. So as always, thank you for watching, and until next time, be well.